We now move on to our next panel, and their area of expertise focuses on international agreements and how they are adapting to climate change. We are very grateful to our symposium co-chair, Dr. Wes Reisser, for putting together a very esteemed panel to discuss this topic. Wes?
Thank you, John, and good morning, everybody. So we're going to do things a little different in this panel, and instead of having any presentation, we're going to have some questions and conversation up on the stage. And I'm hoping to actually save a pretty good chunk of time as well for questions from the audience. And also, I'm going to need this guy, I think, as well. Thanks. So first off, really very happy to be here with you all this morning. I work for the Department of State. While I work on some of the issues we're going to talk about today, especially on international humanitarian and international human rights law, but I'm going to be asking the questions, and unlike the last panel, who I'm sure ran everything they had to do through the arcane clearance process that is something that anybody who's worked in the United States government knows too well, I will caveat that I am up here in my personal capacity as a counselor of the AGS today, and not in my capacity as a government official. But I'm really happy to have a really varied panel. In fact, there's only one other geographer up here with me, Dr. Abbie Tingstad, who we were classmates at UCLA just a few years ago. We also have Dr. Rebecca Pincus, who is here from the Wilson Center in Washington, and Brady Mabe, who is the legal advisor for the International Committee for the Red Cross, their mission to the United Nations. So the ICRC has a quasi-sovereign kind of role in the international system. They're a very unusual thing that's not a country, but has some of the privileges that countries have. But they're really the guardians of what you would call both customary international law, which is law that isn't written down, but is understood, as well as the Geneva Conventions and a lot of the legal regimes around humanitarian operations, the law of war, et cetera. What I really wanted to focus on in this particular panel is a couple things, and that is we talked yesterday about the global commons, right? Those places beyond the sovereignty of states. And over prior Geography 2050s, we've had sessions as well that have looked at the high seas, the Arctic, the Antarctic, outer space, right? These places that fall outside the sovereign boundaries. But also the regimes that we use, both those that are written down as well as those that are customary, are key to two things. One is to allowing there to be cooperation, including between non-like-minded entities, especially countries, right? So the United States and nominally, although maybe not so much, the Russian Federation these days subscribe to a series of rules of the road, as does everything down to Liechtenstein, right? These things apply to the big guys and the small guys in the same way. They create frameworks by which we can manage the global commons as well as manage our relationships between each other. And when these break down, or when they aren't working right, they're not fit for purpose anymore, they can also become a conflict exacerbator. And conflict also can cause a degradation to these norms. And I think we're seeing that in quite significant ways right now in places like Gaza, Ukraine, and Sudan, among others. And so my hope is that we'll be able to chat a little bit about both these regimes, but also the ways in which the system is going to have to change as the climate continues to change. And as climate change continues to also exacerbate conflict of various forms. So I want to start first with a question for Rebecca. And my question for her is, we're seeing climate change obviously globally, but one of the places where the climate is changing the most rapidly is in the Arctic. And Rebecca has worked closely with the Department of Defense on their strategy for the Arctic, as well as studying the impacts that climate change is having for security, especially for small states in the region, right? Like the Arctic is not just the US, Canada, and Russia, right? But we have actors like Norway and Iceland and Sweden and Finland, who are up, and Denmark, who are up there as well. What I want to ask is, over the next 25 years or so, up to the year 2050, what are your biggest concerns in how conflict could develop in the Arctic region, and what role do you see international institutions taking to ameliorate these threats? And are they prepared at all to deal with them?
Sure, great question. And thank you for inviting me here today. It's really wonderful to be here on this very blustery day. But yeah, great question. And, I think big picture, I think conflict is unlikely to be intentionally initiated in the Arctic. Because I don't think it's in anyone's interest to do so. And there is a lot of concern about Russia, certainly, given their aggression in Ukraine and around the world. But Russia wants stability and renormalization in the Arctic because Russia's economic future runs through its Arctic region. And conflict is bad for business. And so I think I am not concerned that Russia is going to launch aggression inside the Arctic, not only because that would be adverse to its business interests and its economic future, but also it would involve conflict with NATO. Over the last 2 years, we've seen NATO expand to include Sweden and Finland, and so now every Arctic country that is not Russia is part of the NATO alliance. So I think there's some really strong brakes on Russian aggression in the Arctic. And again, I think stability is in everyone's interests. However, I do want to flag that there are ample pathways for unintentional incidents or accidents to escalate for a few different reasons. First of all, Russia's risk tolerance right now is very, very high. They are taking on very significant risks that could lead to accidents and incidents, and a couple of examples that I will give you will be their operation of a shadow fleet of unsafe oil tankers that is transiting in the Arctic as well as in other parts of the world, and is a hair's breadth away from environmental disaster, to which one can imagine the response pathways taking any number of directions. Another example is Russia's unsafe military operations, often in close proximity to NATO forces. They will buzz over NATO exercises at unsafe altitudes. Their ships will come into unsafe proximity. They are taking risks. And again, that potential for incident or accident could escalate in a really unpredictable way. Compounding those risks is the Arctic environment. It's a really, really harsh operational environment. Everything is harder to do up there. We have very limited communications. And that operating environment is increasingly unpredictable because of climate change. So we're seeing environmental factors change pretty rapidly, and that, again, kind of adds another layer of risk. Thinking about how to mitigate this risk, we are challenged in the United States and with our allies and partners and with our NATO allies how to mitigate the risk of conflict in the Arctic with our goal right now of deterring Russian aggression. And you can see that playing out in international institutions in a couple of different ways. A really good example is the Arctic Council. The Arctic Council is the region's main governance body, and since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the Arctic Council has been limited in its practices, in its work, because of our collective desire to isolate Russia and to punish it and deter it. And so that has made some of the scientific work of the Arctic Council harder to do. We are not having in-person meetings with Russian scientists. We are not getting Russian data anymore. We're certainly not having meetings with Russian officials. And again, that's in response to their illegal aggression, but it makes it harder for the science in the region to go forward. And so we have to balance those competing desires. It's not an easy decision to make. But it's important to recognize right now that Russia is a bad actor in the Arctic and elsewhere. It is actively undermining international institutions and global norms in the Arctic and also in Antarctica. So Russia right now is blocking forward progress under the Antarctic Treaty System, under the Convention for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine and Living Resources, because many of these international institutions rest on consensus. All parties need to agree. Russia is party to many of these institutions, and it just is not agreeing, and nothing is happening. And that is intensely frustrating, and it gets to your question, Wes, about are these institutions fit for purpose? If we have these bad actors out there that are deliberately throwing sand into the gears, what can we do about it? And that's a really tough question, and I look forward to a conversation about that. And I'll just say that there's a number of international institutions in the Arctic, from global agreements like UNCLOS, the Law of the Sea Convention, to regional agreements like the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement. Some would argue that we need more institutions in the Arctic and they need to be more powerful. I hear those arguments. I think they're pretty unlikely these days. The idea that we're going to create a new institution and it's going to be extra powerful, I think it's a non-starter in the current context. But I think what we do need is to shore up the institutions that we have. They need more data, more sensors, more domain awareness. We need to be able to know what is going on in these very remote locations. And we need more response capacity so that if we see something happening, we can respond and intervene. So I think we can do that in a way that will shore up the institutions that we have, make them more effective without necessarily creating new ones. But again, I look forward to your thoughts, and I'll wrap up right there. Thanks, Wes.
Thanks, Rebecca. You're giving me terrible flashbacks. I work with the US delegations to the UN, and I can assure you in every single international body that Russia sits, they're doing the exact same thing right now. For whatever reason it takes to just piss people off. It really is that simple. My next question is for Brady. And I'll take us out of the really cold places for a second here. The image above is actually from a refugee camp in Sudan. But I think we all know from the daily drumbeat of news, unfortunately mostly about Gaza and Ukraine, although I think from my perspective, the conflict in Sudan is probably actually the greatest humanitarian disaster we face right now. But we're watching this sort of broad body of law we call international humanitarian law, i.e. the law of war, in probably its most challenging moment since it emerged after World War II. And being the ICRC's legal rep here at the UN, you're definitely at the front line of all of these conversations at the global level right now. We're watching norms buckling. Maybe you'll agree, maybe you'll disagree. I would say having completely broken in some of these conflict zones at this point. And there's a lot of discussion within the international humanitarian community about not just how the actions of states, but also how climate is driving and impacting this particular regime, and impacting the way that warring parties within are acting as well. So how do you see this nexus between climate and the stresses on the international humanitarian legal system? And how prepared do you think the system is to respond to more climate-driven conflict in the future?
Thanks very much, Wes. It's very interesting to hear you talk about shoring up the mechanisms that we have, because that's how I feel really about international humanitarian law. Some people ask, what more do we need in the law? And sure, there are areas where we need to tweak here and there, but really what we need more is better compliance, more pressure on parties to armed conflict to act in compliance with the law, better good faith interpretations of the law, and not sort of trying to find new and creative legal solutions. Yeah, but to your question, Wes, IHL is I'll refer to international humanitarian law because it's very long as IHL. It's the law of armed conflict. It's set up to regulate the conduct of hostilities, to protect civilians and other protected persons in armed conflict. And so it's not designed to do everything. In fact, it's silent directly on the question of climate change, but that's not to say that climate and conflict is irrelevant in IHL. Quite the opposite, in fact. I mean, we heard yesterday that the kind of causal links between climate change and armed conflict are not easy to talk about, but it's undeniable that climate change is an exacerbating factor for the humanitarian situation for civilians in armed conflict, and vice versa. People affected by armed conflict are sometimes the most vulnerable to climate changes, and they have the fewest means to adapt. Conflict is also taking place in many of the regions that are most susceptible to climate change right now. So what I can say is that IHL does have a lot of protections for the natural environment. It's not sort of climate per se, but protections for the natural environment. So the natural environment is to be seen as a civilian object, first and foremost, meaning that it should not be targeted directly. There's a prohibition in IHL of widespread, long-term, and severe damage to the natural environment itself. There are other prohibitions, the prohibition of using the destruction of the natural environment as a weapon, the protection of attacking the natural environment as a means of reprisal. There are prohibitions on attacks on objects indispensable to the civilian population, so that would include water stores, it would include agricultural areas, and then IHL also provides for the possibility of establishing protected zones that parties to an armed conflict will agree are off limits, and so those could conceivably be environmental zones. And I think this is directly relevant to the question of climate change for two reasons. One is people can only sort of endure a certain threshold of harm. And the more conflict-related environmental harm, the harder it's going to be for people to respond and adapt to climate-related environmental harm. And so the more that IHL is able to protect the natural environment, the more people are going to have capacity to deal with other kinds of crises. And then secondly, environmental harm as a result of armed conflict can directly have adverse climate impacts. You know, if we're looking at the destruction of forests, for example, it'll have environmental and biodiversity harms, but it also will have a negative impact on the climate as the destruction of a carbon sink. You know, if we're looking at damage or destruction to oil facilities in armed conflict, that's obviously going to have a negative impact as well. So what we're trying to do as the ICRC to respond to kind of these overlapping crises of climate change and armed conflict is, you know, as I said, first and foremost, strengthening compliance with IHL, helping people cope and adapt to and building sort of resilient coping mechanisms for dealing with climate change and environmental risks, making sure that when we're assessing the needs of people, we're assessing that in a sort of a holistic way. We're addressing their conflict needs, but also their climate-related needs. You know, we're working with countries and development and climate organizations and other experts to scale up climate adaptation, environmental protection. There's more to say, but I think I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks, Brady. Abbie, who is we had West Point up, now we have Coast Guard Academy up here as well for the first time. So Abbie, as you're working and obviously unlike colonels, you're working with the youngsters mostly at the Academy. So as you're educating the next generation of the Coast Guard, the issues that they will face in the Arctic, I know have to be at the fore as such a rapidly changing operating environment for the Coast Guard. So I want to shift after a couple of questions that are more about the negatives of now to a positive focus for a moment on cooperation. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, in the Arctic regime, how we see cooperation developing at local scales rather than at the entire Arctic scale writ large. And despite the enormous pressure that obviously these communities and the region is feeling from the larger actors below the Arctic Circle, Arctic communities are doing a lot to address the impacts of climate change themselves and in cooperation with each other. So can you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing on the grounds and ways you can see this local cooperation developing to build frameworks that can aid communities across the region as they adapt to the changing climate?
Sure, thanks. Thanks for that question. And also for the opportunity for once to be the glass half full person. I rarely get to play the positive role, so this is a nice change for once. And I think the short answer to your question is yes, there is a lot happening at the local level. But since I'm an academic, I'll go ahead and pontificate a little bit more, but that's the short answer. What I'd really like to focus on is the incredible knowledge and data and information that's coming out of local communities around the Arctic. And I'm thinking about communities writ large, so that can actually be towns and villages, for example, but can also be communities of practice like the Arctic business community. And there is such an effort to do things like environmental monitoring, sharing knowledge about a changing climate and the impacts on various parts of Arctic societies, knowledge about common challenges that different communities face. And so that is, in my mind, a really valuable contribution that it's not a new thing. I mean, communities have been sharing or trying to share, in some cases, unfortunately not, others, let's say, were not maybe listening for many years. But you know, I've definitely seen in the last 10 years or so a much stronger kind of signal and listening to various Arctic stake and rights holders communicating this information. I'll just use a couple of examples out of the state of Alaska. So for example, the North Slope Borough does search and rescue and emergency response operations. They have so many important lessons to share and, you know, kind of bringing in the next generation of the Coast Guard, right? There's a reason why we run an internship program over the summer where we send a couple of cadets every year up to Utqiagvik and elsewhere in Alaska. And so they can interact and meet with local communities and kind of understand what their future roles as potential emergency responders are and kind of see the people who do this day in and day out. And of course, Becca mentioned, you know, how remote, you know, many parts of the Arctic are. So unlike many of us who live in the lower 48, you know, if there's a horrible disaster, we fortunately do have a lot of resources that can come and help us. But in Alaska, especially the northern parts of Alaska, I mean, and elsewhere in the Arctic, I mean, the local communities are the first responders, and often the first responders for many days. So they really have a lot to teach us, you know, on these kinds of issues. But I'll point out a few other examples as well. We have, for example, the Aleut community of St. Paul Island has, for several years, been a leader in the Indigenous Sentinels Network, which is an environmental monitoring effort, and they have, you know, been doing this for a number of years, and now that effort is expanding and growing, especially now that there are more, there's more access, penetration of digital capabilities. So that's a great example of an effort to bring what local communities are seeing on the ground to the broader picture. Another example out of Alaska, actually a Native Alaskan-owned digital analytics company called Pole Arctic. So they use traditional ecological knowledge and also satellite remote sensing data, among other things, to drive AI models for example, for sea ice prediction or for ecological health estimates and things like that. So just in the state of Alaska, you can see that there are a number of different ways in which information, data, and knowledge is starting to be used more broadly, teaching us a lot about some of the challenges of climate change, among other things. And where this has become really important for international agreements, since we're on that topic, is the fact that the local communities and indigenous peoples, among others, now have increasingly been able to contribute knowledge to how international agreements can be formed, and the monitoring needed to help in their execution and other forms of Arctic governance. And a good example would actually be, some of you may know that there is a moratorium on fishing in the central Arctic Ocean. Now, arguably, that would be difficult to have large-scale fishing operations in that region of the world for the most part, although there are some fishable areas, considering sea ice reductions that have been happening over the last several years. But in any case, there is a moratorium on this, and the Inuit Circumpolar Council has had a large role in making sure that the traditional ecological and other forms of indigenous knowledge are being used and to help inform how the negotiations about that moratorium move forward. I'll just take it back to the Coast Guard Academy one more time here. So one of the things that we've also learned from all of this local knowledge is how different parts of the Arctic are. I'm a big fan of saying if you've been to one place in the Arctic, you've been to exactly one place in the Arctic. So when people kind of wave their hands and say, oh yeah, I went to the Arctic, it's really important to ask, okay, where did you go, right? And so the immense diversity of the Arctic is really important for the governance in the region. It means that like a one-size-fits-all approach is not going to work, and this is something that we emphasize at the Coast Guard Academy in our Polar Area Studies class, where this year they did a very geographical project where each cadet had a specific region of the Arctic that they took what we called like a 360 look at, the culture, the economy, climate change, environment, politics, both domestic and more international. And we had them basically do a geographic kind of analysis characterization. And when they were presenting their regions to each other, you could just see the look on their faces when they realized how different their part of the Arctic that they were studying is from somebody else's part of the Arctic. For example, the cadets that got parts of Russia, there was one cadet who was focused on the Murmansk region, arguably one of the most kind of technologically advanced and well-connected parts of Russia. And then the cadet who had Kamchatka, which is kind of also at the opposite end of the Russian Arctic, but also kind of a polar opposite for a number of other reasons. They really learned a lot from each other, just how different parts of the Arctic can be, and that definitely makes kind of the case, especially with the Arctic dealing with climate change, to have governance systems that can flex with climate, and one big one right now, and I'll leave it at this, is just so much of our agreements and governance in parts of the Arctic Ocean has to do with there being ice-covered waters, like special rules for that, for example, the UN Convention and the Law of the Sea. We might need to be having that difficult conversation about at what point are they not ice-covered waters anymore.
Thanks, Abbie. I wish I could have been in the room during that regional presentation. That just sounds like so much fun. So I have a couple more questions that are going to be for the panel, and then we'll open the floor to you all. So the first one, despite your differing backgrounds, one issue where all of your work coincides is looking at how the impact of sea level rise is going to impact the way in which we cooperate and regulate the global commons, right, and also our territories. And of course, it's going to have big impacts on the Convention on the Law of the Sea, especially regarding territorial waters, exclusive economic zones. It's going to impact flows of internally displaced persons and refugees who are going to be displaced from probably places including South Florida, among others, into other locations as the sea level continues to go up. So can each of you touch on an area of your focus related to rising oceans and how you think the global community will need to handle that particular topic? And do you see the frameworks around that within your area of interest as adaptive to these changes, or are these places where we're going to probably have to start anew?
Do I go first? Okay, okay, that's a big question. So, see, there's a strong connection between the polar regions and global sea level rise, because a lot of the sea level rise is being driven by melting in the Greenland ice sheet and the west and east, in the future, east Antarctic ice sheets. So there's a real strong connection there. And, I think sea level rise intersects with other factors. So in coastal Alaska, for example, we're seeing some of the highest levels of coastal erosion in the world. There are parts of northern Alaska that are losing a football field a year, right? Enormous rates of coastal erosion. And that is a compounding consequence of sea level rise, along with more frequent and stronger storms, and also the loss of the protective barrier of sea ice. So when you put all of those things together, you end up with a coastal erosion situation that's a real crisis and is creating some really significant costs. So in the state of Alaska, we're seeing those costs play out in the form of community relocation, but also there are threats to military installations. We have some of our most advanced radar sites on the margins of our country, and so coastal Alaska has some radar sites that are being threatened by that combination of sea level rise, coastal erosion, and storms. And another place where I think there's going to be a really significant impact, is the east coast of the United States, where we're sitting right now, is going to be suffering some of the worst consequences of sea level rise, again, because of a confluence of factors. So there's sea level rise going up, there's more water. The water is warmer, and of course, because of thermal expansion, warmer water takes up more space, and we've got a large blob of warm water sitting down in the Caribbean, and also because of the storm tracks that come up along the east coast of the United States. And so we are going to have a really significant sea level rise problem all along the east coast here, and there is a lot of critical infrastructure there, and there are a lot of communities. And I think one of the things that I am most concerned about is the fact that I don't think we are ready to juggle multiple problems at once. The costs of coastal management are going to be astronomical, and I think it's going to be very distracting to governments. So for example, in Alaska, there's a lot of discussion around community relocation. There are a lot of small Alaska Native communities that are being threatened along the coasts right now, and we are trying to help them relocate. And that is an extremely painful decision to make, of course, for a community that is deeply anchored in a place. But when confronted with the amounts of erosion that are happening, there is often no choice. The Bureau of Indian Affairs put out a report a couple of years ago estimating the price tag of relocating small Alaska Native communities at about $50 billion. And that is a huge price tag, but that is also just a very tiny piece of the problem. There are, of course, indigenous communities along the Gulf Coast, along coastal United States, that will probably need some relocation assistance. And there's also, as I said, a ton of critical infrastructure, both military infrastructure. A lot of our military infrastructure, especially our Navy bases, are on the coastal regions. You can look at Norfolk already, which is experiencing tremendous costs associated with sea level rise and saltwater intrusion. And there's also a ton of industrial infrastructure. You look at the Gulf Coast, and it's just a large concentration of some really significant infrastructure. And then you think about sort of large-scale cities and communities along the coastal regions. The amount of money to fix all of those problems, to adapt to all of that, does not exist in our system, and I think is going to really crowd out a lot of the mitigation. And thinking about how that's going to play out on the international dimension when it comes to movements of people, I think we need a new paradigm for sort of thinking about what government can do, because the dollars are going to be scarce. And so I think we really need to start thinking about the private sector. The insurance industry is, particularly in Florida, I think is starting to realize the scope of the problem, but I don't think we have good solutions yet. And I think we had better get started, because it's, we hear a lot of people talking about we need more, government assistance for this or funding for this, and we're at a point now where, not just in the United States, but around the world, I think government budgets are going to break under the strain of what is to come, and that's a really scary prospect. Thanks.
So, Becca, you talk about the cost, and I think about the governance issues, where in places without solid institutions or in places that are in the middle of fighting a war, it's that much more difficult to do coastal management, to address the needs of people. And so people are more likely to be displaced by climate change, by extreme weather events in areas of armed conflict, in areas where there aren't solid institutions. So I want to touch a little bit about what the law as it stands now can do and where there are sort of gaps. So, international humanitarian law protects kind of climate migrants to the extent that they are also affected by armed conflict. It provides them the same kind of protections that it does to other civilians, but it doesn't really go further. If we're talking about internally displaced people, there are a couple of regional agreements that do actually have protections for climate-displaced people. The Kampala Convention of the African Union, the Great Lakes Protocol, sort of in the Great Lakes region of Africa, both of those instruments do have provisions related to the protections of people who have been displaced as a result of climate change. But we don't have anything like that on the global scale for IDPs. When we talk about refugees as well, when we're talking about people who are crossing borders, some people who are crossing borders as a result of climate change and sea level rise are also, that's one of several compounding factors. And for those people who are moving as a result of climate change and also the reasons that are covered by, say, the Refugee Convention, a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, that's where the current existing law can protect them. But there's a lot of people who won't sort of be covered by that. So there's a real gap in the law in that sense.
Yeah, I would just add that, kind of harkening back to my climate science days before I got more fully into the polar business, you know, there's a lot of impacts of climate change that have various uncertainties associated with them, they all do, and that some of which are harder to kind of comprehend or understand what the implications are than others. But in my mind, sea level rise is one of those that, as you've heard, it is a train wreck, but we also see it coming because we have a lot of tools to understand it, unfortunately. And so I think this is about getting governance structures in place that motivate change. We don't always have an opportunity to make positive change and avoid like the worst of a potential disaster, but I feel like in the case of sea level rise, we do have that information and that knowledge, and increasingly so. So it's about kind of motivating those conversations that are really difficult in order to change governance frameworks, in order to understand how we need to start interpreting legal systems. You know, one good example, unfortunately, that a lot of low-lying small island states are facing, and this is a horrible question to be thinking about among many others to do with sea level rise, but you know, if our land is fully inundated by sea level rise, are we still allowed to retain our exclusive economic zone? I mean, what an awful question to be asking, right? But these are the sorts of interpretive, questions with a changing climate that, we really need to start having the really hard conversations about.
So the last question I want to pitch to the panel before we go to the audience is one that I think we need to do because obviously sea level rise and climate refugees, as well as just the general state of conflict and tension around the world right now is so high. But at Geography 2050, we're not here just to be the doomsday meeting of everything terrible that's going to happen in the world over the next 26 years at this point, but also to be thinking about solutions and those places for promise. And so can each of you highlight one way in which you think the international community is preparing to better cooperate within your area of expertise to ameliorate conflict and to manage the shared impacts of climate change more effectively? And we'll go in opposite order this time. So maybe to
Thank goodness.
Oh, I get the hard job this time. Okay. Well, I'm going to take this more as an opportunity. I'm not sure it's actually, there's a wrench thrown in the polar governance system that Becca spoke to at the beginning of her opening remarks here. But I think over the years, over the decades, the nations that are stakeholders within the various polar governance systems have, shown some important lessons, not just about how to cooperate, but also how to disagree, and often agree to disagree in some cases. Obviously, there's been sand thrown in the gears, especially by Russia. Though I'll also, I guess, note that over the years, Russia hasn't been the only one to throw sand in the gears periodically. So understanding that does happen, but then how do we kind of persist and move forward and continue with those kind of good governance structures, I think is an important question. And again, I think the polar governance systems, the Antarctic Treaty System, for example, which is of course consensus-based, so easy to throw some sand in the gears there. But I think it has taught the valuable lesson that sometimes we do need a space to disagree, and actually that's okay. Because I think especially somewhat post-2014 and the illegal annexation of Crimea, but I think especially after 2022, of course, we all know what happened then. There's been a bit of a, there are different clubs, if you will. So we've got, the Western club, and then we've got the Russia, China, et cetera club. And, if we disagree, then obviously, everyone else is a bad actor, not acting in good faith. And I would really like to see when the space exists to do so. I would like to see a return to this understanding that, we may not like each other, but we also have space where we can disagree safely and hopefully move forward then. And I think we see plenty of examples of that in the polar regions from years past, where although Russia and China in this case have not agreed to more marine protected areas, but there were 2 marine protected areas that were agreed to. I think it was in 2016. So that was progress as an example. And then, of course, in the Arctic, I already mentioned the Central Arctic Ocean fishing moratorium. That was something that was, agreed to despite, before 2022, but despite, some existing tensions then. So I am hopeful that we will kind of learn some of those valuable lessons and find the appropriate time to come back to this idea that we can sometimes agree to disagree and work through things.
So I want to give, I think, one concrete example of cooperation and then a pitch for sort of more opportunities for cooperation. So every 4 years, the world meets in the International Conference of the Red Cross and Red Crescent. This took place just a few weeks ago in Geneva, and at that conference, several countries and several Red Cross and Red Crescent societies signed pledges related to the protection of the environment and climate change, responding to climate change in relation to disasters and armed conflict, where they committed themselves to ensuring that more climate finance is reaching climate vulnerable people, people affected by armed conflict. And they also committed themselves to better supporting the existing framework, the existing legal framework related to international humanitarian law. So it's good to, it's heartening to see countries committing themselves, paying attention to this issue. Where I think that there's an opportunity for more cooperation in a lot of different areas is that, IHL is doing what it's doing. It's responding to armed conflict. It's regulating the conduct of hostilities. But it can't and it's not designed to do everything. And so in order for IHL to work well and for humanitarian organizations to be able to do what we can, we need sort of climate experts and states to be addressing the climate issue head on so that, we're frankly not the best positioned to do that in a lot of circumstances. And so it's heartening to see sort of a gathering like this where that issue is being addressed. And then the last thing I'll say is that we're on the ground addressing the effects of armed conflict. We have dialogue with parties to armed conflict on both sides all over the world. But we're on the ground addressing the need. We're not sort of in the business of resolving conflict. And so we really need, we're seeing a proliferation of armed conflicts around the world, including in areas affected by climate change. And so we need some peacemakers in the room, frankly, because we can't do it alone. Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah, I love this question. It's a tough one, but I like it a lot. And I think one thing that I've been really impressed by recently is just how much information we have. We have so much data now, and we have such advanced tools that I think science can really play a remarkable role in helping inform some of these major challenges. And in the polar regions in particular, the remote sensing ability that we have, the space-based capabilities that we have paired up with the tools that we get from a sort of advanced computing capabilities and AI, I think are really remarkable. And so, a couple examples that I think are really fantastic. There is a scientist now in Antarctica who studies penguins. And previously, to study penguins, you would have to go to Antarctica and look at them, right? And what she does is take satellite pictures of penguin guano and can take that data and calculate all the way up to the population dynamics with just a space-based picture of penguin poop. It is remarkable, right? And it's so much, you get a great population estimate, so you get fantastic data, and you can do it remotely. It's much cheaper. So that's just, I think, an amazing example. There are also great sensors we have now in terms of space-based satellites that can track methane in the atmosphere and trace it back to a point emission source. Incredibly useful, particularly in a context right now where we're not getting a lot of good data coming out of Russia. The more remote sensing we can do to track climate and environmental data is really, really valuable. There's just incredibly remarkable things that we can do now with the data and tools that are coming on board, and I think that makes science incredibly influential. Also, I will say on the sort of military and security side, our intelligence and our strategic release of intelligence has been incredibly impactful. Again, I'd point to the war in Ukraine as a great example of that. We're also seeing that with regards to other sort of bad behavior. So right now you can think about the data cutting incidents that we have seen around critical subsea infrastructure in the Baltic. Again, we have satellite technology that can tell us what ships were where doing what, and that can be incredibly powerful. So I think we have the data that we need. I think we can use it better, but I think that makes a real difference, and I'm optimistic about where that's going to take us in the future.